Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel Amias Hashem. Today, we will be learning Daf Kuf Pei Tes Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on Kuf Pei Tes Amid Aleph. We are in the middle of Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Yud Gimel. It was an oddity that I stopped in the middle of a Mishnah Berurah, but I did it for a reason. So we pick up in the middle of Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Yud Gimel by the word Nafal. We're in Siman Shin Mem, and we're in the midst of Sif Gimel. Our learning should be a schus. For Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanesunim Batzaru Bashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayamu Bein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachim Aleihem V'Yitziem Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afela La'ira U'Meshibud L'Geula Hashta Bagolo V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus Refuah Shalema for Esther Fradel Bas Chana Bashemer Ben Esther Fradel, Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malka Chana, Yitzchak ben Zion ben Dusha, Rivka bas Shiraleach, Avadasa bas Serel, and Gila Shifra bas Ilana Udal. They should all have a refuah shalema b'seich shar chole Yisrael. So we're in the midst of discussing the topic of moichik, erasing. So we have seen in the Bir Halacha earlier that the ikar av malacha, in the words of the Chavetz Chaim, of moichik is when you erase two letters in order to be able to write two letters, because that's what they did in the Meleches HaMishkan. The source for the Av Malach of Moichik in the Meleches HaMishkan was when they would mark the krushim, the beams that formed the walls of the Mishkan. They would mark them to know which krushim go next to each other. As we spoke out, the krushim had designated spots in the walls of the Mishkan. So you had to know precisely where they went. You had to number them, so you know this is Aleph, this is Beis, this is Gimel. So they would make two marks, one mark on one kerish and a corresponding mark on the next kerish. Sometimes they would mismark them. They would have to erase them. So they would erase two letters in order to rewrite another two letters. In the course of what we've learned, we've seen that not necessarily does it have to be two letters, as long as you give chashivus to what you're doing. So like we spoke out, if you would write one ois to complete a sefer, that would certainly be a chashav malacha. It would be an isser of kaisiv daraisa. So too, sometimes you have to erase one letter that is improper in order to be able to write the proper letter. That would be moichik daraisa. So this idea that it has to be two letters is not exactly fixed in stone. Now also, that's going to come into play today, we learned in the beginning of Sif Gimel, if somebody had a splotch of ink and he erased that splotch of ink, so it's not letters, it's just a splotch of ink, he erased that splotch of ink in order to prepare an area where he could then write two letters, that would also be an isser of moichik daraisa. Now what's important to notice about that case is that over there, you're not erasing letters. You're erasing a tishtush. You're erasing a stain. So you're erasing an ink splotch, but since you're erasing that ink splotch in order to prepare the area underneath it for kaisiv, to have an area where you could write two letters, it becomes an isser daraisa. Now, against this backdrop, let's take a look at this Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Yud Gimel, by the word nafal. Says the Chavetz Chaim, nafal diyoy oy sha'ar davar lach al sefer. If something like wet ink fell onto a sefer, now, from the fact that the Mishnah Berurah uses the words nafal diyoy sha'ar davar lach al sefer, it is apparent, and it's very clear from the Sharitzi on Ois Katan Yud Ches, that what he means is it fell onto the text of the sefer. So in the case that we have here, we have some diyoy, some ink, or shar davar lach, some other type of material or medium that is still wet, that fell onto text. So it is covering up text. Says the Mishnah Berurah, al yilachachenu b'lashaynai, don't lick it off with your tongue. V'al yirchatzenu b'mayim, don't take something wet and try to wash it off. Mipnei shemoichik, because that would constitute moichik. And this, I believe, what the Mishnah Berurah means, is that this really could be moichik daraisa. Because if you have something wet that is sitting on top of pre-existing text, so then when you wipe it off, you are erasing something in order to uncover text. that is moichak almanasli kasev. We've seen that already before. Such a concept that since you're doing it in order to uncover text, even though you're not doing it to write text, but you're doing it to uncover text, that could be a problem. We could see that in the Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Yud, back on Kuf Pei Ches Amid Beis. If you go down, I'm going to say a little bit less than maybe a third of the way down into that Mishnah Berurah, you'll see the Mishnah Berurah brings down a bach. V'ayin bebach tehu adin deyesh li zaher kishenayfel diyoy ala oisiyos. If ink fell on letters, oishanot of shava, shaloi limchayk, oishanot of shava, or wax dripped onto text, shaloi limchayk hatishtush. You can't go ahead and wipe away that stain. Because by erasing the stain, minkar ha'oisiyos, you're making the underlying characters visible and recognizable. The heavy kemoichik almanas lichtov v'chayiv. That would be an daraisa of moichik almanas lichtov, even though you're not writing anything. But by making the underlying letters visible, that is akin to moichik almanas lichtov, and it would be an issa daraisa. What's the difference between the halacha that the Mishnah Berurah brought down in Ois Cotton Yud, the Bach, and the halacha that he's telling us over here in Yud Gimel? I think the only difference is that back in Ois Cotton Yud, we're talking about ink that dried. You have dry ink, and now you want to erase it to uncover the letters underneath. Over here, we're talking about a daralach. It's still wet, says the Mishnah Berurah. Even though it's still wet, you can't go ahead and lick it off. You can't go ahead and wash it off. It would be moichik, and it could be an issue of moichik da'araisa. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. Aser litain shava al hasefer l'siman. You're not allowed to use wax to make a mark on a sefer. B'makom sheroitza la'ayin bala machar. You finished the Dirshu page of Mishnah Berurah, but you went over time to Kuf Pei Tes Amud Aleph. You want to make a mark on your sefer where you have to continue from. So, nowadays, I use these nifty little things like they're going out of style. Back in the day, they didn't have them. So what did they do? They took a little piece of wax, and they stuck a little piece of wax on the sefer. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you're not allowed to do that. Now, this has nothing to do with moichik and nothing to do with kaisiv. Now, it could. If you stick the wax onto the text, then you could have a moichik problem if you covered up letters and now you take the wax off. You could have a problem of moichik amanasli kosev, the bach. But that's not what the Mishnah Berurah says here. Over here, the Mishnah Berurah doesn't say that you're not allowed to take it off. Over here, the Mishnah Berurah says you're not allowed to put it there. Now, putting it there is definitely not moichik. Putting it there is also not kosev. So what is it? Says the Mishnah Berurah, a different problem. B'nei chash meruach. Remember the isser of meruach. Meruach, when you take a viscous, malleable item and you smooth it out, that's the malacha of meruach. Over here, you're taking wax and you push down and smooth down a piece of wax, you're coming up against meruach. I love the way the Chavetz Chaim does this all over the Mishnah Berurah. It shows you how you have to think. You always have to analyze what you're doing, not only in the context of the first thing that comes to your mind. We're learning about moichik, we're learning about kaisiv. This is not moichik, this is not kaisiv. Yeah, but what else might it be? Oh, meruach. Got to keep these things in mind. Okay, now we come to a very interesting Ramah that comes up for discussion quite often. It has a lot of practical ramifications. Says the Ramah, famous Ramah, here on Kuf Pei Tes Amud Aleph. Hago. Aser l'shaber uga. You're not allowed to break a cookie or a cake. Shekosav alea kemin oisiyos. That has letters written on it. Happy birthday, happy anniversary, happy siyum. So you have a cake that has letters on it. Says the Ramah, aser l'shaber uga. You're not allowed to break such a cookie or a cake. Shekosav alea kemin oisiyos, that has letters on it. Af al pi she'eina mechaven rak la'achila. Even though when you bite the cookie, when you bite the piece of cake, your kavanah is to eat it. It's very clear that the Ramah right now is discussing a question of eating it. He's not discussing the question of taking a knife and cutting the happy birthday. I'm not now. Of course, what the Ramah is saying, it applies to that too. This Ramah is saying you're not allowed to do this. He's certainly not allowed to take the knife. Again, we'll talk about the practicality the halacha l'maisa of our cakes in a moment. But what's the Ramah saying? The Ramah says you've got a cake, you've got a cookie, it has letters on it. You're not allowed to break those letters. And what the Ramah says is afal pi she'eina mechaven rak la'achila. Even though you'll say, wait a second, this is definitely a davar she'eina meskaven. I don't have kavanah to break the letters, I have kavanah to eat it. So clearly the Ramah is talking about the problem of taking the cookie and biting into the happy, right? So you're breaking the letters when you bite into the letter. It's davar she'eina meskaven, your kavanah is to eat it. So too, when you slice the birthday cake, your kavanah is not to cut the words, your kavanah is to get a slice of cake, right? So it's a davar she'eina meskaven. Still, he says you're not allowed to do this. Alpha b'she'eina mechaven rak la'achila. The heavy moichik. The reason you're not allowed to do this is because it is moichik. Now, the Ramah brings this down from a Mordechai in Perek Klal Gadol. If you take a look in the Mordechai, and we'll see this in the Mishnah Berurah, the Mordechai does not say that this is moichik daraisa. The Mordechai says that this is moichik darabanan. Why is it moichik darabanan? Very pashut, because moichik daraisa, we spoke out again in the beginning of this year, is when you're moichik amanas likosev, when you erase in order to write. When a person bites into the happy birthday cookie, or he cuts the happy birthday cake, it's zichad not moichik amanas likosev. He's not doing it because he wants to rewrite it, right? He's doing it because he wants to eat it, he's doing it because he wants to make a slice of cake. But it is moichik. It's moichik darabanan. So says the Ramah, you're not allowed to do this because it's moichik darabanan. It's a davar she'eina meskaven. Yeah, but like the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, it's a davar she'eina meskaven, but it's a psik reisha. And we learned already earlier in Siman Shin Tezayin in the Mishnah Berurah that a psik reisha on an issa darabanan is a problem. The same way it's a problem on an issa daraisa, it's a problem on an issa darabanan. You have a davar she'eina meskaven, an issa darabanan, but it's a psik reisha. It's also. So in a nutshell, what the Ramah just said is, you have a cookie that has text on it. You have a cake that has text on it. You're not allowed to eat it and break the icy ice. You're not allowed to cut it and break the icy ice. Why? Because it's moichik darabanan. It's not moichik amanas likosev, so it's not a daraisa, but it is moichik darabanan. And even though it's a davar she'eina meskaven, it's a psik reisha, and that would be a problem. Okay, you're wondering about happy birthday cakes. We'll get there in a moment. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Ice cut in Yudalin. Also, l'shaber umuter litnoi litinoik. You're allowed to give it to a child. Now, this Mishnah Berurah says that you're allowed to give it to a tinoik. Why exactly does he paskin that you're allowed to give it to a tinoik? I mean, cut noichel nevelus ein bezdin mitzuvanov la frisha. You're not. If a cotton is doing something that's also it's drabanan, especially you're not mechuyev to stop him, but you're not allowed to give it to him. Over here, you're allowed to give it to him. It could be because of a lot of different kulas in this halacha that we're going to see as we move around, as we move further. Be that as it may, the Mishnah Berurah says beferish that you're allowed to give it to a tinoik. The Shulchan Aruch Harav says you're allowed to give it to a tinoik, but lo yitein gadol l'soich piv shel tinoik. The Shulchan Aruch Harav says you're allowed to give the cookie that has the letters on it. You're allowed to give it to a child, but you're not allowed to take it and put it into the child's mouth. I think what the Shulchan Aruch Harav is trying to say is you're allowed to give it to the tinoik. You know, when you give a cookie to a tinoik, I've Baruch Hashem raised a lot of tinoikos. When you give a cookie to a tinoik, you never know what the tinoik is going to do, right? Sometimes it's the biggest laugh in the world, you know? You give the tinoik a cookie, you don't know if the tinoik is going to crumble the cookie, you don't know if the tinoik is going to put the cookie down and forget about it, you don't know if the tinoik is going to take the cookie and put it in his pocket, you don't know if the tinoik is going to take it and peel off the letters, you know? Or you don't know if the tinoik is actually going to eat it, or he's going to smell it and decide he doesn't like that kind of cookie. So the Shulchan Aruch Harav seems to be saying that, like I said, you're not mechuyev to be mafresh a cotton from doing this drabanan. You're not mechuyev to stop him from doing it. You're not allowed to give it to him to do it. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch Harav says you can't put it in his mouth. You put it in his mouth, yeah, he's going to bite it. And he's going to be over this drabanan. But you hand him the cookie, you don't know what he's going to do. And if he goes ahead and he starts eating it, you're not mechuyev la'afrishay. So that's the way the Shulchan Aruch Harav seems to take this. Okay, let's move on in the Mishnah Berurah. Very important Mishnah Berurah here. Mishnah Berurah is cotton tesvav. The Ramah said you have an uga shekosav aleha kimin oisiyos that has letters written on it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'davka kishekoisvin al hu'ugos oisiyos midaver acher. This halacha applies when you have letters that are written on the cookie that are made out of something else. Okay, lafuke what? Aval, however, says the Mishnah Berurah, kesha'aksivu hu meha'uga atzma, if the form of the letters is made out of the cookie itself, bitfus, let's say you have, what are those things called? The cookie stampers, you know what I mean, the forms that you use to push into the dough, and it makes the cookie into a certain shape. So you can have a flower cookie, you can have an animal cookie, you could also have a form that presses the dough into oisiyos, into letters. You could make ABC cookies, or you can make a cookie that has an aleph on top of it, out of the form. So in that case, it's not an uga shekoisvin olav kimin oisiyos. It's not a cookie that you wrote letters on. No, it's a cookie that you formed into letters. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this halach of the Ramah doesn't apply in that case. Why, says the Mishnah Berurah? De'en shem ksiva aleha. Because that's not called ksiva. That's not called that you wrote a letter. That's called a cookie. The cookie happens to be in a particular shape. But it's not called, in the words of the Ramah, uga shekosav aleha kimin oisiyos. You didn't write letters on it. And therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, ein shem ksiva aleha. That's not called writing. It's not a cookie that has writing on it. It's a cookie that's in a peculiar shape. Since there's no ksiva over here, if it's not koisiv, it can't be moichik. If it's not right, the avis malachos of koisiv and moichik are interdependent on each other. The Mishnah Berurah is saying, if it is a ksiva, then erasing it could be a mechika. If what you're erasing is not a ksiva, then it can't be mechika. That's what the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here. Let's just finish the Mishnah Berurah before we ask the obvious kasha. Finishes off the Mishnah Berurah. So too, if you put letters on the cookie, and you did write letters on the cookie, you did do it, b'davar acher. It's not the cookie itself. What did you do? You took honey mixed with water. So you took honey, you thinned it out with water, and then you made oisiyos on it. Oishar mei peiros, or you used other kinds of mei peiros, literally fruit juices. Gam kein ein lahachmir. We don't have to make such a chumrah. Now, the Chavetz Chaim in the Sharet Zion brings us down from the Aguda, the El Yerabah, the Chayodam, the Tiferes Yisrael. From looking at the sources that the Mishnah Berurah brings down in the Sharet Zion, it seems that the reason for this is because the Dvash Mu'urav B'mayim, the Mei Peiros, they don't make a writing that is miskayim. It doesn't make a writing that has any lasting ability. It's something that is going to sink into the cookie, or it's something that's going to fall off, or it's something that's going to fade. Memela, since it's not miskayim, there's no problem of mechika. It's not considered a ksav because it's not miskayim. And if it's not considered a ksav, it's not considered mechik. So this Mishnah Berurah seems to say, this halacha of the Ramah, that you can't break the letters on the cookie or on the cake, it doesn't apply if it's made out of the cookie itself. It also doesn't apply if you used something that's not miskayim. But how about frosting? Frosting, we wouldn't know really what to do with from this Mishnah Berurah, because this Mishnah Berurah is kind of like walking a tightrope. You see, if the Mishnah Berurah would have said, it's only if you write on it with something else, but if it's the cookie itself, then it's not a ksiva. Okay, so then we would say the line is a very clear line. The line is cookie itself, this halacha doesn't apply. Anything that you put on the cookie, the halacha does apply. Mishnah Berurah doesn't say that. He says cookie itself, the halacha doesn't apply. Dvash Mu'urav B'mayim, the halacha doesn't apply. Mei Peiros, the halacha doesn't apply. He doesn't say why. Looking into the sources, it would seem because it's not miskayim. That's what we seem to have from this Mishnah Berurah. We'll speak about this a little bit more soon. Okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah, so the Ramah spoke about a cookie or a cake that has letters on it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, there are those that are machmir even by shapes. So a flour cookie. There are those that want to be machmir that a flour cookie, not a flour cookie, that would be a cookie shaped into a flower, but a cookie that you drew a flower on would also be a problem of moichik. Same way the Ramah says if you made Aleph Beis Gimel on the cookie, it's a problem. If you made a flower on the cookie, it's also a problem. You have a shape, and you're going ahead and you're erasing a significant shape. That would also be a problem of moichik, according to some. Ois Katan Yud Zayin, and what's the problem over here? That be moichik. Now, first of all, says the Mishnah Berurah, 1 second. This is moichik? Va'af de'enoi amanas lichtov. Now, wait a second. Moichik is only a problem in Daraisa if it's amanas lichtov. Yeah, but like I told you from the Mordechai, Isur d'Rabbanan miya ikka. You're right. It's not moichik amanas lichtov, so it's not a Daraisa, but a d'Rabbanan it is. Now, I told you that there was an obvious kasha on this, and I'll tell you what the kasha is. Really, it's a few lines up in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah said that why is it that if the letters are cookie itself, it's not a problem? Because if it's cookie itself, that's not called ksiva. You didn't write something, you formed a cookie into a particular shape, or into a letter, or you stamped a round cookie with an aleph on it, but it's made out of the cookie. You didn't write anything on it, so it's not ksiva. If it's not kaisiv, it can't be moichik. That's what the Mishnah Berurah said over here. But wait a second. We already had earlier a case where you're erasing something that is not a ksiva, and it's still a problem of moichik. I spoke it out in the beginning of this year. If you have an ink splotch on a piece of parchment, and you go ahead and you erase the ink splotch to clear away an area on the cloth where you could write two oisiyos, we said that that's mechika daraisa. Why? I didn't erase a ksiva, I erased an ink splotch. So what's the Mishnah Berurah telling me over here? Oh, the letters are formed out of the cookie itself. It's not moichik. Why? Because it's not koisiv. There's no ksiva. If there's no ksiva, it can't be mechika. What do you mean? By the ink splotch, it's not a ksiva, yet there's mechika. The answer really is, it lies in what we just said here in the beginning of Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Yud Zayin. The problem over here is moichik derabanan, right? Even though it's not amanas likasev, but it's moichik derabanan, right? Because we're talking about a cookie that has writing on it. You're erasing a letter, even though it's not amanas likasev. The halacha of erasing the ink splotch, the reason that's a problem is because it is amanas likasev. Over there, you're erasing an ink splotch in order to be able to write two letters. Over there, we're going to be machmir, even though you're not erasing a ksiva, you're only erasing an ink splotch, but since you're doing mechika al manas likasev, you're doing it in order to clear away an area on the cloth where you could write two letters. Over there, it is a problem. But over here, it's not mechika al manas likasev. So over here, you have two strikes against this being usher. It's not moichik al manas likasev, and if we're talking about letters that are made out of the cookie itself, it's not a ksiva. So you're not erasing a ksiva, and you're not doing an al manas likasev. In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah, that can't be usher at all. Okay. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, even though, like the Ramah himself says over here, there's no kavana for erasing, you just want to eat the cookie or slice the cake. Psik reshu, it's a psik resha. Va'aser af b'derabanan, a davar she'ein miskavin, but it's a psik resha, is also even by an isur derabanan. V'chedemuchach b'simin shin yud vav, otherwise known as Shin Tezayin Sif Dalid. We saw that in Shin Tezayin Sif Dalid. Where did we see it? Well, in Shin Tezayin, we spoke about the malacha of tzad, of trapping. And we said over there, if you have a beehive, and you want to protect the beehive from the elements, so you take a mat, and you put a mat over the beehive, if there's no other opening in the beehive, So you're covering up the only opening to the beehive, right? So then it's a psik reisha that you're trapping the bees inside the hive, even though that's not your kavanah. Your kavanah is to protect the hive. That's your kavanah. But the bottom line is, you take the mat, you cover up the only opening in the beehive. It's a psik reisha that you're doing tzeda. We said it's aser. Now over there, the tzeda that you're doing is a drabanan. Why? Because we're talking about bees. And we said that bees is a davar she'ein b'minoi nitzoid. That's not something that is considered that people trap them. People generally don't trap them. So it's ein b'minoi nitzoid, it's an issa drabanan. And you see, even though what you're doing is at worst an issa drabanan, and it's a davar she'ein miskaven, but since it's a psik reisha, it's aser. So to over here, psik reisha is aser by an issa drabanan. Now comes a very important piece of the Mishnah Berurah here. The Mishnah Berurah, brings down a dogel merivava that takes issue with this entire halacha of the Ramah, that you're not allowed to cut or bite this cookie. Vayin b'sefer dogel merivava, says the Mishnah Berurah. Take a look at the sefer dogel merivava, shemitzadid lahakal be'ikar hadin hazeh, who takes issue with this Ramah and is mekel keneged this whole Ramah. Ve'aviyoi b'shari tshuva, and this dogel merivava is brought down in the shari tshuva. V'yesh lismay chalav kishe'ena shoyver b'mkaima oisiyos b'yadoi rak b'fiv derech achila. And the Mishnah Berurah takes the position that you definitely could rely on this dogel merivava if you're not taking a knife and cutting the letter. If instead what you're doing is you're doing it derech achila and you're biting on it, we could rely on the dogel merivava in that case. Now, the reason why the dogel merivava is mekel, the dogel merivava is mekel for several reasons. The dogel merivava does the math over here. He says, first of all, we're dealing with an issa d'Rabbanan. We're talking about moichik, that's shaloi almanas likosev. So it's an issa d'Rabbanan. Then it's a davar she'ein miskaven. Now, we said davar she'ein miskaven, psik reisha, issa d'Rabbanan, it's still aser. But hello, it's a d'Rabbanan, it's a davar she'ein miskaven. You're doing it klachayad. If you're eating it, then the way that you're breaking the oisius, you're definitely doing moichik klachayad. You're doing moichik with a shinui. Nobody does moichik by biting into things, so it's definitely moichik with a shinui. And says the dogel merivava, it's also makalkel. You're ruining the cookie. When you bite the cookie, when you bite the cake, you're destroying it. So it's makalkel, which is another reason to be mekel in Hilchos Shabbos. So it's a drabanan. It's a davar she'ein miskaven. It's klachayad. It's makalkel. Says the dogel merivava, mekel. He doesn't agree with this halacha of the Ramah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you could rely on the dogel merivava when all of those factors apply. So if you're biting the cookie, so then it's klachayad, because you're biting the cookie. But if you take the knife and you cut the letter, that's not klachayad. That is moichik kedarkoi, right? You want to break the letter, you break it with a knife. So then you're losing one of the reasons to be mekel of the dogel merivava. Okay, now I want to read to you the lashon of the Aruch HaShulchan. You see, it seems to me at least that the vast majority of people are not makbid on this halacha, and we do cut cakes that have letters on them. So let's take a look here at what the Aruch HaShulchan says. The Aruch HaShulchan says, Ein ha'olam nizharim bazeh. The Welt is not careful about this halacha, and they do cut cakes, etc., with letters. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, v'ulai, maybe the reason is, mipnei shekala tziyurim oisiyoi she'oisam almina mesika, all of the forms, pictures, shapes, or letters that they make on cakes and cookies, etc., heim meha'isa atzma, either they make it out of the dough itself. Well, if it's made out of the dough itself, the Mishnah Berurah already said that the halacha of the Ramah doesn't apply. Oy mehatavlin, or they make it from the spices and the flavorings. In other words, they take chocolate chips and they line up chocolate chips in the shape of letters. That would be tavlin. Frosting would be tavlin. Tavlin doesn't necessarily mean spices. It means edible flavoring things. So frostings would be tavlin. Ubazeh vadai deloy shayich shem kisiva. And the Aruch HaShulchan says, once it's made out of something edible, it is not called ksiva. Why? Duhu gam kein Michael. Because the Aruch HaShulchan says, the point is that if the letters or the forms or the shapes are made out of mine meichel, if they're made out of edible items, it's not called ksiva. It's called food. It's not called ksiva. Mutter legamri, and it's mutter legamri. The kavanas Rabbeinu Ramahu, the Ramah that brings down this issur, what is he talking about? Kishakasav oisiyos midyoi oy mitzava. He was talking about where they wrote on a cookie or they wrote on a cake using ink or some kind of dye, but it's not a food. Then it's taka a problem. He brings down the Dalgum Ervava. And he says that the Dalgum Ervava's tam is kein bazeh shem ksiva klal, v'hu mekalkel, u'kalachayad, like we spoke out. The ein bazeh shum isser. I know that that's the way, me personally, that's the way I'm noyeg. I'll pee my Rebbe. That's what the psak that I was makabel is that we do cut cakes that have letters on them as long as they're made out of edible substances. Okay, moving along, let's finish off this Mishnah Berurah. Is cutting your Zion. Says the Mishnah Berurah going weiter. The Sefer Shekasav Alav, this is another Shaila. I remember this Shaila coming up when I was younger. I haven't heard this Shaila already in a bunch of years. Maybe it's not as negay as it once was, or maybe the psak of Rav Moshe was, and not just his psak, maybe the psak halacha became more widespread. The Sefer Shekasav Alav Barashi Chudei Dapav Oisiyos Oitevos. What happens if you have a sefer that has writing on the edges of the pages? What that means is you have a sefer and you have writing or printing on the edges of the pages over here. So I know that when I was younger, the Brooklyn Public Library used to do this all the time. I guess they didn't want to just stamp the inside of the book. They wanted somewhere on the outside of the book where their stamp would be visible. So they would stamp out here, this book is property of the New York Public Library. And then when you open up the sefer, you break the letters. Oh, so that was the shaila that came up. You have a ksav, and you're breaking the ksav. Is it a shaila of moichik? Says the Mishnah Berurah, sefer shekasav of Roshei Chudei Dapav Oisiyos Oitevos. If you have a sefer that has letters or words on the edges of the pages, yesh oisrin lepaschay lena'aloi b'Shabbos. There are those that aser opening it or closing it, and that would be the Levush, the Magen Avram. He says in the Shar Tzina Maimar Mordechai, all say that, yeah, it's a problem. You open the book, it's moichik. You close the book, it's kaisiv. So they were takamachmer on this. They said you know how to do it. By opening the book, you're breaking the letters, and you're doing moichik, vevi kim moichik. Now he says kim moichik. He doesn't say the heavy moichik. He says it's kim moichik. The chein kishanayaloi have a ki kaisiv. And when you close it, it is like kaisiv. It's not kaisiv, but it's ki kaisiv. Okay. Avol das Ramah b'tshuva, but the Ramah writes in a tshuva lahakel bazet that you could be mekel. V'chein das harbe achrayim, and maybe many other achrayim agree with this, including the Shulchan Aruch Harav. The time and the rationale is the asu yilino of tayach tamid. Since these books in Sfarim are meant to be opened and closed all the time, lekabei misha mechiko ksiva. There's no mechika and ksiva. This is the nature of this kind of stamp or this kind of writing. It's asu lekach. It was never intended to remain whole and intact all the time. It was always intended to be opened and closed and broken apart and put back together again. And therefore, it's like the door of a house that's meant to be opened and closed all the time. We don't say that when you close the door to the house, you're being boineh, you're building the door into the house, and when you open it, you're being soiser. You're demolishing the house. You're making a wall. Look at that. You made a 36-inch by 7.5 foot tall opening in the wall. Mamish, soiser. No, it's not boine. It's not soiser. Why? Because that opening is meant to be there, and it's meant to be opened and closed. Same thing over here. These letters are meant to be broken apart and put back together again all the time. And v'chein haminik u'mikamalkaim nachad la'achmir. The Mishnah Berurah does say that if you have a different book that you can use, you have a different sefer that doesn't have that problem. So the Mishnah Berurah's position is nachain lahachmir, that it would be good to be machmir, and he brings it down. He says it's mashmir that way from the Chayei Adam and perhaps from others as well. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time with Sif Daled. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be made on Gans Klal Yisrael. The Ron Shem should send Yeshua Sefuas Parnas and Sheduchim to those in need. We should be zoichet to see the BS Tzedek B'mher v'Yameinu Amen. Be well.